Okay, well, very, very good morning to you all and welcome to the second day of the National Evaluation Capacities Conference 2024. I hope you enjoyed the first day as much as I did yesterday. It felt like a very special occasion, and I want to give you all a round of applause for your participation. As you know, one of the major issues facing evaluation is how we include people who sometimes get left behind. And so we're going to start the day with a plenary session on inclusion. We then have 3 sets of parallel sessions during the day. And we're going to finish the day with a very exciting trip to the Great Wall of China. Some people here have been to the wall before, but I think you haven't been to the wall before at night. So please dress warmly, put on a scarf, and ready yourself for what I think will be a wonderful experience. Please note, though, that food will not be served as part of the trip. If you're a little hungry creature, try and eat something before the trip. The restaurant will be open from 5 until 6. The bus will leave at 6:30, and you'll be very sad if you get left behind. Also, if you're still hungry upon your return to the hotel, the restaurant will be open and you'll be able to nourish yourself then. The workshops are a key part of this event. They're on Thursday and Friday. If you haven't signed up for a workshop, please do so on the NEC website, not on the Hoover app. If you have trouble accessing the website, which some people do, please speak to one of the volunteers with the vest and they will help you register for a workshop. For help with questions relating to Yangqing or for any items that you need, the volunteers are also very willing to help you. And if you need a handheld translation device, it's a device that you can speak into and it then translates either into your language or into Chinese. Please speak again to one of the volunteers. I'm going to offer you a very quick summary of what was discussed in the sessions yesterday. I don't want to steal too much time from the plenary, so I'm going to keep it pretty short. But amongst the things that emerged was the fact that barriers to evaluation capacity include what is described in my notes as low political will, but I don't think it's low political will. I think it's inconsistent and unreliable political will, because sometimes political will is very strong. But the other issue that came up regularly was the need for clearer, stronger incentives in the M&E systems. There's a lot of agreement on the need to better integrate budgeting and resource allocation into evaluation, or actually evaluation into budgeting and resource allocation, better integration of evaluation into legislative and policy frameworks, better attention to human resource allocation and development, and the building of technical capabilities. A big theme that came up yesterday was the consistent problem of isolation and the fact that people feel they work in silos and they struggle to get out of their own little cubicle. Amongst the enablers that were identified yesterday are the existence of large-scale capacity-building programs, such as the GEI, efforts around addressing the need for legislative requirements, that there is, in fact, in many instances, a strong commitment at a political level. There is community demand for evaluation, that there is an improvement in the government planning culture, and that there are emerging natural partnerships between allied professionals, including, in particular, statistics. I was delighted last night to meet people from the Ghana National Statistical Office, and I think the relationship between evaluation and statistics is strengthening. But there are many fields in which evaluation needs to grow closer links. Behavioral sciences, decision-making, deliverology, these are all things that we as evaluators need to come to understand better. Research, audit are some other fields, GIS. Opportunities around building on what already works within existing systems was recognized as another opportunity. And generally, evaluation is being recognized as a way to strengthen the evidence base for voluntary national reviews. One of the things that was also generally agreed on yesterday was a great need for focus on country and household level assessments, And I think one of the other big themes that came up, especially in the plenary upstairs, was the need to institutionalize climate and environment into national evaluation agendas and to ensure that this, which is becoming an increasingly technical field, has got the capacity being built to be able to address those challenges in the evaluation space. There was agreement that inclusion should not be addressed at the expense of independence. And generally, I think there's an understanding that country-level systems need to integrate as well as possible with the UN systems. And this relates particularly to the nexus between humanitarian, development, and peace program evaluations. When you get back to your room at the night and you're tired and you're lying on your bed, the endless delights of Hoover await you. Please do use the app. It's actually a treasure trove, and there's wonderful content to be engaged with there. There was also agreement on the integration of the call from governments at the SDG Summit on Public Sector Transformation, the future of government, to integrate evaluation further into the public sector and government institutions and practices. We understand the need for coordinated advocacy and a stronger, clearer, more compelling value proposition on why evaluation matters. I think we really need to make a better case for why evaluation is a very specific form of evidence generation that lends itself well to evidence-based policymaking. What's very heartening, and which was commented on extensively yesterday, were the increased alliances emerging across professions related to evidence. And these focus on things like personnel, methodology, evidence-based practices, to interface more coherently with government partners and counterparts. There was a general consensus that we need to be more constructivist. We need to build on what exists. We need to take account of what's already out there, and we need to use existing evidence collected across most sectors. Generally, there was agreement on a need to focus on demand-driven, nationally led, inclusive evaluation work. And just a little punt, I think what was very strong yesterday was an agreement that environment and climate change should be at the center of policy, project, and program design, and that this work needs to be informed by evaluations that integrate these fully. And with that, I hand over to today's moderator, Isabelle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dugan, and good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well rested and ready for another big, exciting day. So, I wear many hats in my job. I am the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP, and I'm your host for this conference. I'm also the chair of the United Nations Evaluation Group. I'm the co-chair of the Global Evaluation Initiative. I'm the co-lead of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition. But the hat that is nearest and dearest to my heart is that of a mother of 4 children. And as a proud mother, of course, you'll indulge me to do one of the things that I love to do the most, and that is talk about my children. In particular, I want to share the story of my eldest daughter, who is now 23 years old. Shortly after her first birthday, we found out the devastating news that she had advanced stage cancer, something called adrenal cortical carcinoma. By the time she was 2 years old, we discovered that the chemotherapy that saved her life had also taken away much of her capacity to hear. Over the course of the next 21 years, my daughter has taught me and continues to teach me many things about what it's like to live with courage, what it means to live with a disability, and what inclusion really means. My daughter has graduated with a master's degree and is working as a social worker, working with vulnerable populations. She's been an advocate for disability rights and inclusion in her school, her community, her work, and nationally now as a patient advocate. She has lived exclusion, but she has mostly lived what I call bad inclusion. People have told her whole life what it is she needed and how they could help, But more than not, they would do this with good intentions, but they do it without her input. So there's a slogan that emerged from the disability rights movement in North America in the last quarter of the past century. And this is a slogan: nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. I think it's a simple statement and it speaks volumes. For my daughter, it affirms that she has an interest, a point of view, an experience that matters in articulating and shaping the public discourse, policies and actions that have an impact on her life. And when I extrapolate and apply this to my context as an international development evaluator, the message resonates loud and clear. Nothing about us without us. We can't hope to capture the correct insights about public policies and programs if we don't integrate the multiplicity of voices that are impacted by them. We can't hope to implement quality programming if we don't understand what works and for whom. I think the good news is that evaluation is capable of supporting inclusion. It has the tools in its toolbox to provide a platform for inclusion. Evaluation is capable of having people for whom public policies are designed help shape its direction through enhancing the data and its interpretation. We do have ways to create inclusive recommendations and to ensure they're implemented in the right way. It is possible. The speakers today will tell us how we, as a community of people interested in shaping public policies so that they're inclusive and equitable, can leverage evaluation to support this goal. And with that, I will introduce our esteemed panelists. I have Dr. Candice Morkel. She's the director of Clear Anglophone Africa and has 27 years experience in government, academia, and the nonprofit sector, specializing in M&E and public policy. Candice works with governments and development partners across the African continent to help build better systems of evidence production and use towards strengthening national evaluation systems. She's published peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and edited books on M&E, and supervises local and international master's and PhD students in evaluation. She is a legacy board member of the African Evaluation Association, legacy chair of the South African M&E Association, and is currently a board member of the International Evaluation Academy. Please welcome her with some applause. We have Sanjeev Sridharan, I'm sorry, I don't know if I got that right, is professor of health policy evaluation at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Previously, he was the country lead learning systems and systems evaluation at the India country office of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Prior to this position, Sanjeev was director of the Evaluation Center for Complex Health Interventions at St. Michael's Hospital and associate professor at the Department of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. He's a former associate editor of the American Journal of Evaluation and has been on the boards of the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation, New Directions for Evaluation, and Evaluation and Program Planning. Presently, he is an evaluation advisor to the United Nations Internal Oversight Services. The focus of his work is on operationalizing the concept of sustainable impacts in evaluations. He's working on a book titled Made in Hawaii, How a Consideration of Indigenous Epistemologies can help reshape a evaluation criteria. He's been the lead editor of a New Directions for Evaluation volume titled Building Capacities to Evaluate Health Inequities, Some Lessons Learned from Evaluation Experiments in China, India, and Chile. And we'll welcome him too. Then we have Silvia Grandi, who is a Deputy Director of Evaluation at Global Affairs Canada. She has more than 15 years of experience in design, managing, and conducting evaluations. Prior to joining Global Affairs Canada in 2019, she worked as a monitoring, evaluation, and learning advisor for international NGOs and as evaluation consultant for several UN agencies, including UN Women, UNICEF, and UNFPA. Her evaluative work has had a strong focus on gender equality and integration of feminist principles in evaluation practice. Silvia's academic background is in international relation, development studies, and program evaluations. Welcome, Silvia. And finally, and last but not least, we have Huang Baoyin. He is the current secretary of the CPC UIBE Committee and chair of the University Council at the University of International Business and Economics. He has previously held roles as the director and secretary of the General Party Branch at the Graduate Education Development Center, director of the Division of Arts, Science, and Medicine, and various deputy director and director positions at the Office of the State Council Academic Degrees Committee. Majoring in economics, Chair Huang got his bachelor's and master's degrees from Renmin University in China. He is a CPC member originally from Liaoning Province, China. Apologies. Welcome. So, the theme of this session is inclusive evaluation. How can diverse perspectives drive equity and sustainability in accountability systems? Knowledge is linked to social, political, historical, and cultural context. For evaluation systems to drive action, they must grapple with complex contexts, navigate institutional dynamics, and address power structures that hinder SDG progress. We'll start with our questions. First question, and I'll direct it to Silvia Grandi. Is inclusion in evaluation systems just a matter of representation, or does it also require a fundamental shift in how knowledge is valued and produced?
Thank you, Isabelle, for the opportunity to be on this panel. It's a real honor. Thank you also for launching me the first very challenging question to start with, especially from where I sit as a government evaluator from a global North donor country. So at Global Affairs Canada, in recent years, we've put a lot of effort in reflecting and trying to understand what it means for us to move towards truly inclusive evaluation systems and by extension, evaluation processes, and how to make them a reality in our context. The impetus for this came especially from 2017 with Canada's feminist international assistance policy that really pushed us towards thinking about how to do international assistance differently, and so also evaluation differently, integrating principles of inclusion, participation, empowerment in everything we do. But of course, it was also coming from our own reflection as evaluators on how can we be true to locally led development agendas, decolonization agendas in the work we do. So back to Isabelle's question. Of course, broad representation of the diversity of evaluation stakeholders in the evaluation process is a first key step, I think, towards inclusion. And this includes, of course, those people or those actors who are maybe not usually included in our evaluation processes, those who are more difficult to reach, those who are further away from our capitals, thinking about local actors, for example. And at a minimum, at least in our experience, this has entailed really valuing a diversity of data sources, methods of data collection, and really making sure that our evaluation processes include a diversity of voices that are relevant to the evaluations that we're doing. It also entails making sure that these voices are valued and represented in our evaluation products, our reports, but also any other products that can come out from our evaluations. As I said, however, this is a first step. It's not enough for true inclusivity. So the big question that we've been asking ourselves has been, who has a seat at the table? Who really gets to influence our evaluation processes and the evaluation use? And this has to do about shifting power and promoting ownership of evaluation processes and its product by key stakeholders. Again, not only the usual suspects. So this requires a change in our evaluative habits, in our evaluation systems, in our evaluation practices, and it's not easy. We've definitely been through this process ourselves at Global Affairs Canada, trying to think about, okay, so how do we do this in practice? And we thought about a few ways to do this. We expanded the scoping and design phase of some of our evaluations to allow for broader and more inclusive consultations with the diversity of stakeholders involved in the evaluation. We opened up our evaluation governance structures, for example, evaluation reference groups, again, to have a broader representation, not only of Global Affairs Canada staff and decision makers, but also partners, program participants. We also try to make our evaluation process and products more locally owned. This, for example, we transitioned to more locally led country case studies as one of the key lines of evidence for our evaluations. And we also created more spaces for participatory sense-making with a diversity of stakeholders to help us better define our findings, but also our recommendations based on the diversity of views that need to contribute to an evaluation process. As I said before, not easy, still learning a lot, we're still experimenting, trial and error, probably get to that. But I think this is really crucial if we want to stay relevant, responsible, responsive, as per the theme of this conference, to the really complex context in which we work. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia, for giving us a nice opening and sharing Canada's experience with the complexity of this and sharing the initial efforts. Thank you. I'll ask the same questions to Sanjeev. What are your thoughts?
First, thanks for including me in the panel. Thanks to SIDCA and UNDP for making it happen. A special shout out to Michelle Tsai. Inclusion is about people going far beyond their work, so let's start there. I want to first react to your story. I just thought your introduction moved me. Connection to your daughter is when I started my sort of working with the communities when I was in Glasgow, in Scotland. One of the stakeholders reminded me at the start of an evaluation, remember, your intervention is insufficiently imagined, and please respect how we think about it. I've never forgotten that, and I would challenge you to look at your own intervention and ask yourself, has it been sufficiently imagined in the way people are going to lead their lives? I bet the answer is no. That requires a stance of humility, where you cannot start off by saying, my theories of change and my program design, even if I've talked to stakeholders, is the coolest act in town. No, it's not. If you're talking of people's lives, start with insufficient imagination. Words number 2. Remember, I have a friend in Hawaii who keeps saying, and it's going to sound fancy, but hang with me, epistemic injustice is the worst kinds of injustice. What does that mean? It means you imposing your thinking on others is not okay. That is the nature of every single program. When we talk about mechanism, we're talking about how people reason and rationalize our programs. That means you have to listen to what others are saying. When is the last time you've seen a theory of change that actually describes heterogeneous mechanisms? Our start-off position is a standardized view of the world. It's homogeneous. We need to bring in heterogeneity into our thinking. That also means in the way we define quality. I heard the word rigor being thrown around quite a lot yesterday. Not once did I hear a talk about how do we incorporate context and inclusion in the thinking of rigor. And too often rigor is defined in terms of rather silly and 1960s kind of notions of evaluation design. I think it's time to move on and think about context in a much more serious sense. That also means we've got to think about evaluation criteria. I'm just not convinced. Why would a bunch of folks sitting in North America or Europe actually know about criteria that matters in the Pacific Islands that are facing existential crisis? Again, in the same spirit of insufficient imagination, let's respect that. That also means how we think about data. I think much of our fascination with large data and big data comes at the expense of warm data. And by warm data, I mean data that connects the individual to the community, individuals to each other. There's a field called warm data that's growing. So all of this is simply to say it's not a fundamental shift, it's a seismic fundamental shift that's required.
Thank you. Yes, getting applause for that. I like that phrase, insufficient imagination. I think we'll try to remember that one. Now I'll ask Candice, in what ways does a focus on inclusion differ from a focus on diversity and equity? What are the implications of this on evaluation practice and evaluation systems?
Thanks, Isabelle, and good morning, everybody. And also, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really appreciate it. So I think, like representation, the terms inclusion, they can be manufactured, and I think they can lack authenticity. And I think we can all think of examples of this. So in South Africa, for example, in the early days of our democracy, we had a lot of legislative changes to ensure that we had, for example, black economic empowerment, and that we had people of color included into the mainstream economy. But what that regulation meant was that there was a lot of what we called window dressing. And we had companies, for example, having people like gardeners, domestic workers, signing on the dotted line as directors of companies. But they had no idea what they were signing for. And even though these companies, for example, generated huge profits and got lucrative contracts because they had representation, suppose that they had black representation on their boards and so forth, and in the C-suite, these people who were actually, how they had engineered this, what meant was that these people had actually they got absolutely no benefit out of it. So that's a very extreme example, but I think that it signals to us that we can use the terms diversity and inclusion. And I think in the private sector, for example, we've got an entire industry now around diversity and inclusion, and we've got a lot of training programs. But the problem is that if they lack authenticity and they don't really create meaningful change, I think it's a very shallow and superficial intervention. And I think, Sanjeev, you talked about the criteria. One of the lodestars of our evaluation practice are actually the OECD DAC criteria, for example. And they've got a very powerful steering role. I think in the majority of our evaluations, we take them as an industry standard. However, in sort of kitchen talks for us in the Global South, we've talked about concerns about the fact that equity isn't a defined criterion. Yes, it is dispersed within the document, you can find it, but it's not sufficiently foregrounded, and maybe to steal Sanjeev's term, to say that it's insufficient. And what this means is that there's a lost opportunity to unearth the hidden systemic inequities in our development practice and in development planning, in fact. So what we've done, for example, in South Africa, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, along with the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association, actually developed a guideline on integrating a transformative equity criterion into evaluations to promote transformative systemic change. So that's one way to find points of leverage. I think, for example, if we, in our terms of reference for evaluations, or wherever we've got that kind of agency, to use those points of leverage so that it's not superficial change, and not the kind of window dressing to say that we've just included, a local person in our evaluation team, but they don't really, nothing changes systemically in terms of how development planning took place, or even in the asymmetry of power in the evaluation team, for example. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really like those words, authenticity and not superficial. And I think I see that link there with what Sanjeev was saying about humility. Knowing that we don't know everything. I've always thought that one of the virtues that defines a really good evaluator is humility. Because without humility, you really can't learn. And so, with that, I'm curious to hear about examples where we are learning And I'm asking panelists to share examples of interventions that have promoted an inclusive approach. And I'll ask the question first to, I'll ask it to Huang Baoyin, who has his mic ready.
好，谢谢。今天这个主题啊，特别有意义。包容性评价。我4年前写过一篇文章，就是关于包容性评价。我不知道我那个文章是不是比较早啊，也是关注这方面问题。我的经历呢是长期在中国的教育部工作，长期负责大学评价、原生教育评价、学科评价，也做过了很多国际间的教育评价的比较研究。所以我觉得包容性评价特别重要。包容性评价不是目的，包容性评价是为了促进包容性发展。我们各个国家、各个民族啊、各个群体都有自己不同的历史、不同的现状、不同的发展诉求，所以评价是为了更客观、更真实的反映实际情况，来促进每个个体发展。所以刚才主持人讲了2点，我非常深刻。一个是讲到他孩子的成长，一个伟大的母亲，一个成功的孩子。我也看过那本书，叫做《Nothing Without Limit》，介绍澳大利亚还是加拿大一个尼克一个小孩，在出生的时候也是身体有一些障碍，但是在家人朋友的帮助下，他非常的成功，也成了一个励志的一个典范。刚才主持人的介绍让我也很受感动。那么他讲到包容性评价的时候要处理好包容性和自主性的关系，我也非常赞同。所以我觉得评价是为了发展。那么评价呢，我觉得4点非常重要。一个是价值导向，我们评价什么？为什么评价？评价的目的是什么？价值导向。刚才主持人说的，我觉得很重要。从个体来讲，我们每个人都很重要，每个人都要发展，每个人都要成就他自己的精彩人生。对于每个国家、每个民族、每个群体，同样这个道理。第二个就是政策驱动，我们政府在包容性发展，特别我所从事的高等教育，在高等教育包容性发展过程中，政府的政策作用特别重要，而且要长期的、可持续的、整体性的、系统性的推进。第3个，资源配置。我们这次大会的主题就是为政府决策服务。那么通过评估评价，为政府决策提供更多的参考。特别今天的主题是为了推动公平与可持续，那么资源配置就要往这些具有价值意义的领域进行倾斜、进行配置，不然一切就没有行动。第4条就是我们评估的方法方式，刚才几位谈到了，我都认同。那么我觉得这个话题很大，时间有限，我不展开说，我简单回应一下主持人说一个案例。中国高等教育在过去几十年发展迅速，希望大家有时间可以研究中国高等教育的发展。它是包容性的发展，是和谐性的发展，是跨越性的发展。那么到现在，我们不断的扩大高等教育的供给能力，扩大高等教育入学机会。我们现在中国有高校3000多所，那么这些有研究生教育单位，有本科生教育单位，有高等职业教育单位，我们极大扩大高等学校、高 高等学校的入学机会。现在我们中国的毛入学率已经超过60%以上，这是很不容易、很不容易的。我们不断的加大高等教育投入，长期以来，我们教育的财政经费占经济总量4%以上。我们现在已经建成世界上最大规模的教育体系。我们不断的加大学科专业调整力度，适应经济社会发展需求，促进学生就业，更好的发展人生，特别大力发展高等职业教育，为孩子们培养更多技能。所以现在我们在这个领域也取得很好的一个经验。现在我们国家积极推动国家教育数字化战略行动，因为现在是数字时代，为我们学习型社会和我们的终身发展提供服务和平台。同时，我们特别建立国家奖助体系，帮助那些发展相对滞后的地区和孩子提供完善的奖助体系，让每个家庭、每个孩子不因家庭经济困难而错失入学机会。同时，我们在招生政策中有专门的政策安排，帮助这些相对发展落后的地区的孩子更有机会入读好大学，实现他们人生的发展，等等等这些方面，我觉得中国在这些年来，特别近10年来，高等教育领域里的包容性发展、和谐性发展非常快。反过来，我们的评价就是来促进我们这些实现没实现包容性发展，实现没实现和谐性发展。所以我说，评价要和目的结合，评价要有利于促进发展。谢谢。
Thank you very much for sharing the impressive results of the world's largest higher education system and your efforts to make it more inclusive. Silvia, I wonder if you want to share experience from the Canadian perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to share a few examples from a couple of recent evaluations that we conducted. One was the evaluation of the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, and the other one was the evaluation of the Partnership for Gender Equality. These are two global programs to mostly support women's rights organizations in the Global South, and they were both flagship initiatives of our Feminist International Assistance Policy. I would like to mention for these two evaluations, we applied what we call at Global Affairs Canada our feminist evaluation approach, which means that these were evaluations that no matter what label we use to define them, systematically focused on trying to be more inclusive and really try to shift power. So some examples, going back to some of the things that I mentioned before. This idea of shifting powers towards local actors. What we've done in both of these evaluations, we put a lot more emphasis on country case studies as a line of evidence, but what was important for us was that these were country case studies that were led or co-led by local evaluators in very close partnerships with local participants being mostly the women's rights organizations that were supported by these programs. And when I say developed in partnership, it means that the co-design involved identifying what priority questions the case studies should look at, how data should be collected, how findings should be validated, who should be included, and even what the final products should look like. So from our side, from our evaluation team, we provided very high-level, sort of generic guidance that by design had very little detail, because the idea was to give as much margin as possible to our local evaluators and local stakeholders to really weigh into designing a case study that responded to their needs. This approach was met with some surprise at first, I must say, by even our local consultants. Say, really? You don't have a report template? Like, no, we don't. But then also with a lot of enthusiasm and appreciation for this kind of approach that was maybe not expected from, again, what I said before, a donor and a government department. Another thing that emerged quite interestingly in these case studies that we had not expected was that one of the things that was the most appreciated from local stakeholders involved in the process was the opportunity to convene, to exchange learning, exchange experiences, which had not necessarily happened as part of the programs that we were evaluating. So there was this kind of unexpected consequence of it. One more thing that we did in these case studies, I would like to mention, is that we asked our local consultants to think about what were the barriers to participation from, in this case, broader populations to the evaluation process. So, for example, to data collection. We asked them as one of the deliverables to develop what we called an inclusion and participation plan, where we asked them to identify these barriers, but also to identify costed ways to address them. And we set aside some of the budget of the contracts to fund these strategies. So things like paying for childcare or paying for some of the transportation, paying for some of the data usage, for example. Little things that for us it would be usually very difficult to include and to pay for. Again, but in this way we were able to do it. I think I will leave it at this. I would be happy to share much more if you have questions.
Thank you, Silvia. I'll ask the same question to Sanjeev. Do you have some examples you want to share?
Yeah, I like this saying that equity is being invited to a party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I say that because it's not hard for a foundation like the Gates Foundation or universities with power, whether it's University of Hawaii or Toronto, to invite any number of people to a party. It's quite a different thing to get somebody to get excited to participate. This is important because part of the problem of health are folks who don't feel included. And that implies our disposition matters, how we do things matter. The program I'm going to focus on, I work on brain health with folks in Toronto and Ontario. There's this remarkable program called Dancing with Parkinson's. The idea of Parkinson's, as you know, is a neurodegenerative disease which affects mobility. And about 10 years ago, the program started once a week, focusing on dance as the solution for Parkinson's. And then COVID, I want to mention COVID in all of these discussions because that is the big unknown that continues to be. And I think for us, as we think about inclusion, we should not forget that we are still navigating that. Dancing with Parkinson's could not continue in-person classes, but they moved to a daily platform on Zoom. They have not stopped for a single day in 4 years. They moved from an hour of a class per week to 20 minutes of class per day. That soon became 45 because they realized that it was not dance people were after, it was social connection. They started with 30 people per class per once a week to about 250 spread all across the US and Canada and Europe per day kind of stuff too. I say all this because hallmarks of inclusion is the sense that what else can I do for you? How do I adapt both to your realities as well as this thing called COVID? This is remarkable itself. How do I continue to adapt? How do I continue to create a warm space? Once they realize people are not just there to dance, they were there to actually connect. One last comment. I think for me, I'm increasingly interested in inclusion, not at the start of an intervention, but throughout the intervention. So when I was at the Gates Foundation, there was a remarkable group that was doing work on gender empowerment. They were one of the few groups that actually tested assumptions in the theories of change. I found the report exciting, but boring in the sense that it was not useful. I had them go back to the very communities and have them unpack to the very people they had collected data from on how their own learnings. And turned out that their own assumptions were sort of really blown out of water once people reacted to the reports face to face, spending an entire week with them. So I think inclusion requires that kind of dynamic stance.
Thank you. So I'm hearing about the need to adapt. Completely agree. That means that you have to grapple with a certain level of uncertainty, and I certainly know, Silvia, that was some of your experience of, I don't know what's going to happen now, and I don't know what's going to happen later. It's a bit scary. So I'll ask Candice. That's one of the challenges, is uncertainty. Can you talk about the unique methodological or other challenges of inclusive evaluations or evaluation systems, and help us give ideas about how we could overcome them?
Thanks, Isabelle. And I just want to just go back to perhaps touching on the issue around, you know, the previous question that was asked, because I think it's really important for us to ask questions around why inclusion and why now, and as the evaluation community to realize that we are part of the bigger global community, and with globalization, of course, there have been other drivers of, you know, the movement towards inclusion in our sector. So the global discontent, for example, with oppression, protracted inequities, you know, violence, and these things affect the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our communities, and they are the Black and brown people of this world. And I think that some of those drivers, you know, what happens in evaluation, because of our sense of exceptionalism, sometimes I think in the evaluation community, we forget that we actually are ensconced in the bigger questions of the world. So I think we need to remember that there is a bigger global discontent with some of these things as well. And how are we either, you know, being complicit in that, or, you know, do we have a consciousness about it? So I think for me, it's really important for us to have a greater consciousness as the evaluation community of our place in all of that, because sometimes even in our systems which continue to do what they've done, they can actually create more harm. So the issue around, for example, we're talking about representation and we're talking about inclusivity. We should really, really be mindful of not doing, you know, the superficial thing of maybe just in our evaluation practice changing things, but forgetting to look at the more systemic problems. And this is where I want to touch on what a lot of evaluators, I think, you know, there's a movement in the African continent around decolonizing evaluation and made in Africa evaluation. And a lot of work has been done lately around the epistemic violence, that's the other term that's been used, around this, you know, asymmetrical kind of power play around knowledge and knowledge production. And I think that we see this at various levels. And, you know, there's an article by Professor Begele Chilisa and Nicole Bowman in the Journal of Multidisciplinary Evaluation. And I'm going to read you the quote there. And they support this argument that it's evaluation isn't value-free, it's value-laden. And their quote is that there's a need for each evaluator to question the philosophical foundations of their beliefs, where they come from, and the ways these beliefs influence how they go about doing evaluations and how they position themselves in the context of the history and social theory of evaluation. So this movement around changing the thinking around how do we think about knowledge and knowledge production, we've been doing sort of like a body of contributing to a body of knowledge about this, thinking about this and reflecting around this. So for example, there's been, you know, there's a huge project around new methods and approaches and techniques for indigenous evaluation methods that can be used and can be seen as bona fide, you know, rigorous methods of evaluative inquiry. So there's a whole program and project that's being funded to do that work. We have also been funded as the Clear Anglophone Africa by the Fawn Foundation to look at equitable evaluation. So we've got a 3-series book, and the 3rd series we're just starting production now, where we started talking about theoretically what does it mean to have equitable evaluation. And now we at the phase where our 3rd volume is about the actual practical application of that. So we're doing a lot of epistemological thinking around this. And not necessarily in the evaluation space as an organization, but there are others in other parts of the global south who are doing, you know, work around indigenous evaluation. I know that the Eval indigenous community, they are here as well and are doing really excellent work in that space. I think that some of the other examples are around working with national evaluation systems. So here we've been talking since yesterday, and I think I'm really inspired by the Chinese government, for example, on the contextual relevance of their national evaluation systems. And I think we have a lot to learn from that, because what we are doing as CLEAR in our work and with the GEI, for example, is about strengthening national evaluation systems to be country-owned and country-led. And I heard Dugan talk this morning about the alignment of, development cooperation, multilateral organizations, evaluation systems to national evaluation systems. And I want to impress upon us that it's not for the national country-led systems to align to the systems of the UN agencies or any other agencies, other multilateral and bilateral institutions operating in the country. It's for those multilateral and bilateral institutions to align theirs to the national evaluation systems. So the growing of the capacities and the capabilities of the state to evaluate, I think, is really important. It's the more systemic answer or question around inclusion. So it's not necessarily about inclusion of citizens in the evaluation process, but it's some of the systemic back-end things that really do affect as well the continuing protracted inequalities we see in development.
Thank you so much. And yes, the hidden systemic challenges, I think, are things that we need to continue to unpack. I'll ask the question about the unique methodological challenges of inclusive evaluations to Huang Baoyin. I'm curious to hear about your interventions here, your challenges.
我觉得包容性评价，我觉得今天这个主题特别好。我们包容性评价是为了促进公平与可持续，所以我觉得包容性评价基于是相互尊重、相互理解、相互促进。那么每个方面的评价都有它的独特价值。说在评价过程中，如何基于事实和客观条件设定评估方法、评估工具。那么这里比如说以高等教育评价来讲，哪些指标列入评价体系，哪些指标它的权重如何，那么这些方面直接影响评价结果。所以我觉得现在在大数据时代、数字经济时代，我们现在最大的变化就是变化。说是未来以来，实际上未来每天都离我们不远。所以我觉得难点就是我们怎么在包容性这个大的一个概念范围内，我们实现各方面的统筹合作。比如说今天我们很多国际组织协调各方，共同在价值理念上能体现共同发展、公平、可持续。在这个价值导向范围内，我们使用哪些评价体系、哪些评价方法、哪些评价工具，我们可以相互借鉴、相互探讨。因为我们今天的话题呢，我觉得相对来讲比较宽泛。那么聚焦起来呢，我就包括不同的主体。刚才这位女士讲，评价主体很关键，是政府评价、第三方评价、国际组织评价。那么评价的目的是什么？谁来评价？我想呢，这个方面今天来的各方嘉宾，我们也希望今后加强各方合作，包括发挥我们大学的作用，发挥我们专业评估组织的作用，发挥我们专家学者的作用，发挥国际组织的作用，在评价方法、评价理念、评价工具方面相互借鉴、相互启发。谢谢。
Thank you. Love that, learning from each other. That's what we're all here to do in this conference. I think, Candice, you talked about Indigenous knowledge. And I'll let you come in if you want, even though your name's not on the list, but I think you may want to come. But I'll ask the question first to Sanjeev. What are the key uncertainties in promoting an inclusive approach in Indigenous or other contexts that evaluators need to address?
I think the first point is already what I've said, that you've got to respect that you don't really know it all. You don't actually understand the person's context. I would go further. In indigenous context, in Hawaii, for example, the histories of colonization is deeply disturbing. It continues to be so. So my first comment really is pay attention to context in its multiple senses. There are multiple definitions of context: an individual context, historical context, community context. When I was at the Gates Foundation, we'd have folks coming from all parts of the world talking about great theories of change and to implement a program in Bihar or UP, Uttar Pradesh, and I'd say, do you understand anything about the context of the community? The answer was more often than not, no. So pay attention to context, but I want to stress history, historical context, and trauma. There's a real deep, continuing sense of trauma that's compounded with climate change issues in the Pacific Islands itself, too. These are all very, very real issues. I just want to say one or two other things. Language matters, and I think we are too caught up as though the English language or whatever language we use is somehow perfect. I'm blown away when I understand how Hawaiians think about the world. There's a lovely word called kuleana, which means responsibility in the deepest sense. Pono, which means doing the right thing. Aloha, of course, which is everything what I'm talking about in terms of inclusion is about treating folks with warmth. There's a lovely word called ike, which also means observation, but also means intuitive understanding of the world. In Hawaii, you have license to think intuitively and use words like spirituality in open discourse. So I just find the freeing of language also matters. There are ramifications of this. I think we've got to clean up our act in terms of how we think qualitatively in our dynamic qualitative metrics. What are dynamic qualitative metrics of understanding change itself too? I've already sort of talked about how we need to challenge rather traditional and power-driven ideas of either evaluation criteria and theories of change. There are, and not to mention measurement. All of these are call for fundamental shifts.
Thank you so much. Really curious about dynamic qualitative methods. Completely agree, we need more space for that. Candice.
Thanks. Yeah, just very quickly, I think one of the uncertainties is that the fight is seemingly harder. I think there's been a repositioning of donor agendas, for example. There's less money, more conditions attached to evaluation agendas, and I think it's made it harder, certainly in the spaces where I work. And so in the case of donor-led evaluations, for example, we see that accountability it always has driven the agenda, but it's becoming a little stronger now in the current context, and it's driving the evaluation purpose. And so, I've seen some pushback and concerns raised around accountability when we broach the subject of inclusivity. And we have to look at where is this fear coming from? What is the fear about? And I've been thinking through some of these things. It's almost as if the fear is that a more inclusive and participatory approach opens the door to loss of rigor, to loss of accountability. And we're not saying that we need to replace accountability, but I think we need to have an expansive view of what is the purpose of evaluation. We've got a menu and a broader taxonomy, if you wish, on the purpose and the use of evaluation. There is a learning aspect to evaluation as well. There's knowledge, there's development. So I think we need to open our thinking around that. And so for me, that's one of the key uncertainties, is that are we pushing the accountability agenda too strongly? And how do we address that kind of pushback? Some of you might have seen, for example, the interview by the Guyanese president on BBC Hard Talk. So if you're not sure, where some of the trauma is coming from and where some of these issues are, if you listen to that interview, I think that's a very good example of the fact that we are struggling here. The battle, the fight is still there, and we need to, and in this kind of global context where, politics has become so polarized, it's impacting on our evaluation space as well. So in the microcosm of where we're making the decisions about what kind of evaluations to fund and do we have the room and the space for more indigenous methods, it's in those microcosms that the bigger issues are, we are having to fight those battles in those smaller areas. So I'm really concerned about that. But the other concern as well is that we're not painting the picture that the national evaluation systems at country level are also all that inclusive. And in fact, there's a paper that we wrote together with my colleague from Senegal, the Clear Francophone Africa office, the director, Edwe Dimitri, and Toko Molawa is here from the South African Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and Ian Goldman. So we started asking these questions about, how do we decolonize even national evaluation systems? Because there is a sense of instrumentalism that has come on board there, where we see systems mimicking each other for the sake of just, sort of copy paste is what we call it, that these institutions are set up. You've got the people, you've got the policies and the guidelines, but they're not creating meaningful change, and they don't really include the voice of citizens in the decision around, for example, what the evaluation agenda is or evaluation processes. So my second concern and uncertainty, I would say, is that how do we make sure that we build national evaluation systems that themselves are more inclusive, that include more socio-ecological aspects and are not these ironclad bureaucratic monoliths that just mimic other, big machinery of government that really doesn't have a meaningful impact on citizens' lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to say that thing you said about this concern when you say we're going to incorporate different forms of knowledge, and we're going to be more inclusive, that it's somehow an attack on rigor and accountability. Certainly something I faced very much. Silvia will remember my previous role in the government of Canada when I said, okay, we're going to do feminist evaluation now. There was just a horror of what this might do to dismantle all the great work we had done. And I thought, I didn't think we had it perfect. And I was perfectly happy to challenge what we had done, because I thought it could only make it better. And I think it has. I really do. So I'll pass the floor to Silvia, who perhaps can share some of that anxiety that she felt when she was tasked with doing this work, the feminist evaluation.
Thank you, Isabelle. And yes, definitely, that was one of the big themes, but maybe taking it more to a positive spin. In more recent discussions, we were having this internal retreat in our team with lots of new people on the team, where we were going through some of these approaches for more inclusive evaluation processes. And one of the people around the table said, but of course we always do that, right? That's the way good evaluation is done. I'm like, oh, well, that is very refreshing. And this is maybe 3-4 years after we started the process. So again, not a need to use the label, but the need to stay true to some of the principles, and seeing that, for our newer staff, that just made sense. So that was a bit of a positive spin on that. But going back maybe to the question of some of the uncertainties, I think for us, one of the big remaining uncertainties is around some of the trade-offs of meaningful participations, or how to avoid bad inclusion, as Isabelle was mentioning before. And the first thing that comes to mind is more participation means a higher risk for overburdening participants. We always ask for more time. We always ask for more engagement. So the question of, and of course, we always ask it on a voluntary basis, but still, we take away time from very important work that these organizations are doing. And so for me, making sure that we always think about that balance, and maybe reframing the question, what's in it for them? What is the value add for our participants to be part of our evaluation process, beyond the inherent value of participation? So, and that's something that I'm really encouraging my teams to think about. Okay, if we ask, what do they get out of this? The other aspect is, how do we make sure that our participation spaces are truly accessible and relevant to participants? I would like to give an example, going back to the first evaluation that I was mentioning, the Women's Voice in Leadership evaluation. We set up, and we were very proud of it, a reference group that had equal participation of Global Affairs Canada staff, implementing partners, and participants. And we engaged different members in equal way across the whole process. So, yay, great points for representation. We realized that it was actually really hard for the participants that were women's rights organizations coming from very different contexts, often quite local or grassroots organizations, to meaningfully engage in our exchanges. There were inherent power dynamics in that group that were difficult to navigate. And there was also an issue that our evaluation products, deliverables, because they were global, they were quite high level, they were difficult for them to grasp on, like just to make a meaningful input on, just because they were so far removed from their lived experiences. So we definitely learned from that. We've kind of tailored more our stakeholder engagement strategies so that now they're more diversified based on this. And maybe one more thing is, of course, by nature, by design, through an inclusive process, we want to hear and receive a diversity of inputs and perspectives in our evaluations. But then at the end of the day, we have to make sense of this. And we're asked to, at the end of the day, to have a cohesive, meaningful message that comes out of our evaluation. So how do we reconcile that kind of moral imperative of giving justice and truly valuing the diversity of perspectives, including when they're at odds maybe with each other, with the fact that at the end of the day, as I said, we have to have some clear messaging out of our evaluations. Those are some of the more existential questions that we've been dealing with. There's some very practical ones as well. Timelines. Real inclusion requires time, and sometimes we are under strict orders to deliver evaluations within very specific timelines that don't always allow for that luxury of time. Some of our procurement processes or other we're working big bureaucracies. We have our own processes. So procurement comes to mind, where we were trying to contract local evaluators, and our procurement officers came back saying, well, but we have a list of pre-approved Canadian evaluators. Why don't you use them? And it took some time, some convincing. Again, Isabelle remembers this. Again, now we have our written rationale ready. Every time we go for a new contract, we have that and we send it along. So it's not solved, but we're getting there. So there's a lot of trial and error, as I was saying before.
Thank you, Silvia. Trial and error and a real willingness, I think, to keep trying. And that's very important. So we're nearing the end of our session. We have one final question, and I think it's probably the most important question. Is how can we ensure that inclusion in evaluation systems is not merely symbolic? Candice, you've already mentioned a few things about this, but that it leads to meaningful change. And my question says for marginalized communities, but I'm going to change the question. I'm going to say, how does it lead to meaningful change for everyone? I'm convinced that inclusive evaluation will lead to better policies, not just for marginalized communities, but for everyone. Sanjeev, I'll pass that question over to you first.
I think as we come to an end, let me sort of play off what others have said. First, I think we need a broader view of accountability. It's just remarkably narrow and remarkably 1970s and 1980s. It doesn't feel like 2024. And when I see most funders talk about accountability, when I see universities talk about accountability, in Hawaii, they'll tell you what's your accountability to future generations. There's a certain sense that the past is in the present, and there's a certain more mystical view of the world. I like it because it actually challenges us to think about accountability in a deeper way. I love Silvia's point about don't engage people if you can show them why their engagement matters. Evaluation, every single dollar you spend in evaluation is dollar taken away from other things. Please treat evaluation itself as an intervention. All the rules of the game that you're asking of the intervention also apply to you. You have to show worth about it. Again, coming back to Candice and also Dr. Baldwin's point, I think we need a different kind of evaluator going forward for inclusion. And we used epistemic, I talked about epistemic injustice, you talked about epistemic violence. I want to throw in another kind of epistemic fluency. How do you actually train people to actually not freak out when they think about RCTs versus feminist evaluation. That sort of shows a rather antiquated knowledge system. That's 3. 4, too often we are too caught up in evaluating projects. We don't actually know how to build memory in systems. So inclusion is a dynamic problem. It doesn't end with your project report. How do we actually contribute to memory? I'll end with a knock on, I work with Ray Poston, and what works for whom is a very realist stance. I don't want to give it a free ride. Here's why. We actually don't quite know going up front what contexts matter. And I think even people who are deeply immersed in what works for whom don't actually accept the fact that our knowledge of context are not good enough up front, and you still need a humble view of learning that says, how do I learn about contexts that matter over time? Only then, over time, you can come to what works for whom.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Candice.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that I absolutely love this topic on humility. I think you started with that, Isabelle. I think it's really an important characteristic. I think our deep-rooted, protracted problem of inequity and injustices, meted out to the marginalized and vulnerable, largely black and brown people of this world, is really a root cause of many, many of our problems that we need to be really conscious of. I think we need to have a consciousness and a conviction about this. For me, that's really, really important. The internal awareness of how you think about the world and these kind of injustices, as well as the external consciousness about what's happening around you. And then the conviction that you have a role to play to change that. I think for many, many years, evaluation has prided itself in being this sort of objective bystander or, somebody on the outside. This ideal, typical, normative idea of an evaluator being objective and on the outside and not really impacted by these things. I think we need to change that. And even when we teach evaluation, teach people that these things you're talking about, Sanjeev, are really important. And I think that, we need to really look at strengthening local capacities for evaluation. So not just, strengthening capacities of local evaluators to strengthen decentralized and centralized evaluations for donors and other partners, development cooperation partners, but actually the local capacities for country-owned evaluation systems. I think that's really, really important. That's, some of the work or most of the work that the GEI is doing. I think that we need to admit that even country-owned systems are challenged with inclusion. So even there, we need to also not give national evaluation systems a free ride. We need to be quite firm about the fact that those systems need to also be inclusive. I think I talked about conviction already. We need to get that conviction that inclusion is necessary. We shouldn't think about inclusion meaning loss of objectivity, loss of rigor, loss of accountability. It is fundamental to what we do as evaluation, because evaluation is value-laden. And I think we're still dealing with the basics of national evaluation systems in some countries. So capacities and capabilities for inclusion are sometimes a stretch. And I'm talking here specifically, many of my colleagues on the African continent, we're trying to build our systems on the continent, and we're still dealing with the basics, of just setting the basics and the foundations in place. We need to make sure that we talk about these issues, that this is not an actualization process that, when I've got the basics in place, then we'll talk about inclusion. It has to be set in place in the foundations when we build these systems from the beginning.
Thank you so much. And that ends it for the questions. We have this esteemed panel here for another 7 minutes. So that means we have time for questions. I'm sure some of you have some questions. I already see a hand up. So we'll take perhaps 2 questions, I think. And we have a mic going over. Wonderful. And please say your name and I know who you are. Go ahead.
Well, my name is Ada Ocampo. I'm the president of the Ideas Global Network. Thank you very much for this panel, and I think it is very, very important, very relevant at this point. I am very much in line with Sanjeev when he emphasizes the context, the importance of the context, and I think he did in various of his interventions. Talking about the context, we are facing a very, I would say, critical situation all over the world. And among the various crises that we are facing, environmental, political, etc., democracy in many of our the countries of the global south, at least, is being threatened. So if that is the situation, the question I have is, this is affecting the possibility of actually building or having national evaluation systems that are equitable, that embrace inclusion, etc. So the question I have is there any difference when one talk about inclusive evaluation in contexts where democracy is being broken, vis-a-vis some other countries where democracy can be stronger? And related to this, is human relations, is human rights, both individual and collective human rights, part of the equation when we talk about inclusive evaluation? If so, how do we do that? For example, are guidelines really taking into account in the context and probably different scenarios of context and embedding human rights, individual and collective, when it comes to give guidelines for inclusive evaluations, to teach or to actually advise countries on how to build their M&E systems? Thank you.
We'll take a second question and then we'll pass it on to the panel. I can't see who had their hand up next. I think the woman with the white vest, perhaps? Yes, you.
Thank you for your presentations, very insightful. So I'm happy to learn that one of the guest speakers mentioned about OECD criteria. So I'm personally interested in the timing for revisiting this criteria. As we know, the OECD criteria has been updated maybe around 2018 or 2017. At least the discussion of revisiting, updating started from 2017. So now I wonder whether the time comes again to update, to revisit those criteria. Thank you.
Well, we have Megan and Jorg. Jorg is the chair of the Found. Perhaps he'll be able to answer that question on the criteria. But I'll pass it to the floor. Who would like to tackle these these excellent questions?
I'll start with the second question, even though it's the easier one. I'm sure Megan and others in the room will have a better answer for you, but my answer to your question is, I have a forum of papers written by Pacific Islander authors due on November 10th to the American Journal of Evaluation, where I've kind of said, let's hear multiple voices on what are the challenges in evaluation criteria. I just say that not facetiously, to say it's time for us to have internal dialogues, not necessarily run by the UN or OECD, to kind of find out about our experiences, both positive and negative. I think that's part of what scholarship and evaluation means. That's one. I think IDEA's question is challenging. I think those are extremely fair issues to think about the shrinking of political space and dialogue. It impacts inclusion in many ways. I'm going to broaden the question to say what I've learned is that is one of many areas that shrink dialogue. I argued for more warmth and this idea of inclusion as being asked to dance. How do you kind of, along those lines? I think there's also a kind of quiet strategy about evaluation that I don't think I have a clear answer for, but I think it takes a little bit. So I feel like the answer to Ida's question is, of course, yes, the need for more inclusive voices become stronger when faced with shrinking of democratic dialogue spaces, but it also needs the kind of strategic approach to evaluation that sort of is subtle and smart in countering those things even more. I'll leave it there. There's a lot of detail there that maybe over a coffee, Ida.
Over to you, Candice. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to Ada for those very, very deep questions. I think they're hard questions. There's no simple answer to it. But I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier on, where we're doing some thinking around what is happening with the assimilation into the global order of things. We're finding many, many countries are asking for national evaluation systems, and we look at those systems sometimes and we wonder what the impetus is for it. Is it about just assimilating into what everybody else is doing? And we looked at some theories, for example, around there's a theory called old institutionalism and new institutionalism. And the theory of old institutionalism tells us that especially bureaucracies will assimilate into, the democratic or let's say the global machinery or patterns of what's happening globally in other democracies or other countries, because that's assimilating into what everybody else is doing. And with this old institutionalism, what comes with it is sort of this ironclad bureaucratic hierarchical system where it's driven by accountability, it's driven by compliance, it's legalistic, it's regulated, and it really has nothing to do with using evaluation for learning or improving decision making. So I think that if you have a bad democratic system or a bad system of governance, you're going to have a bad national evaluation system. I don't think you can create something good in the bureaucracy or in even a broader that includes even non-state actors, because it's going to be dictated by what the I think the political system is currently. And for me, I think that's the concern that we have, for example, in our work in building national evaluation systems. So when we do our diagnostics, for example, when we go in there doing the monitoring and evaluation systems analyses, which is sort of our first step that we take into the system, we begin to ask those questions. What's the rationale for establishing the system? Because I think there's a huge danger of just going in there and, us assisting to put in place the policies and the people and the guidelines and so forth without realizing what this is meant to do, because it could actually do more harm. I think we need to move from doing no harm to actually doing good. And for me, that's the important sort of shift in our thinking that we're doing.
Okay, and I see we're up on time. Time for coffee. Please join me in thanking our esteemed panel for their interventions. Thank you very much. And we'll rejoin in sessions at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.